She fed two hungry kids with her last few dollars. 15 years later, a stranger in a luxury car showed up at her door. What happened next will leave you speechless. The low growl of an engine broke the calm on Evergreen Drive. Danielle Morris paused mid-step, her hand frozen on the rusty latch of her front gate. She turned her head slowly toward the sound and felt her breath hitch. A sleek black car, long, polished, and so glossy it mirrored the July sun, rolled to a stop right in front of her modest one-story house. It wasn't the kind of car you saw often in Wichita Falls, Texas, unless someone was lost. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside. Danielle's first thought, wrong address. Must be. She wiped her hands on her faded jeans, smearing a streak of dish soap across the thigh. Her heart thudded in her ears like a loose drum. The car door clicked open, and out stepped a man in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than her annual paycheck. His shoes gleamed like glass. He adjusted his jacket, turned, and locked eyes with her. For a split second, she thought maybe he was a lawyer, someone here with bad news, or worse, a debt collector. Danielle's stomach clenched. She didn't know much, but the stack of bills on her kitchen table told a different story about how tight things had been lately. Mrs. Morris. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but deep enough to carry across the yard. Danielle blinked, gripping the gate like it could anchor her to something familiar. Yeah, that's me. Do I know you?" The man smiled, not the smug grin she expected, but something warm, nostalgic even. He took a slow step toward her, and for a moment Danielle felt like the earth tilted under her feet. There was something about his eyes, dark, steady, searching, something that made a whisper stir in the back of her mind. "I've seen those eyes before. You probably don't remember me," he said, his voice dropping to something softer, almost reverent. "But I've been waiting a long time to see you again." Danielle's mouth went dry. Again? She scanned his face, trying to place him, but nothing came. Not the sharp jawline, not the expensive watch on his wrist, not the calm confidence that radiated off him like heat from asphalt. "Sir, I think you might be." "No," he cut in, lifting a hand. Not rudely, just enough to stop her words. "You're the reason I'm standing here today. The reason I have a life worth living." Danielle's brow furrowed, confusion twisting her gut tighter. She'd lived a quiet life. No big risks, no big wins. She worked. She paid bills. She kept her head down. So what was this man talking about? Before she could respond, he smiled again, slower this time, like he was savoring something important. 15 years ago, he said, you fed two hungry kids in a diner when nobody else would. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. A flicker of memory, a sticky vinyl booth, a couple of tiny faces, wide-eyed and tired, surfaced in her mind like an old photograph rising from water. Her heart stuttered. He saw the realization bloom in her eyes, and his smile widened. Not flashy, but full of gratitude that felt almost overwhelming. "I was one of them," he said simply. Danielle's knees nearly buckled. She gripped the gate harder, trying to steady the rush of emotions hitting her all at once. Shock, disbelief, a strange sense of familiarity wrapping around her like a warm coat she hadn't worn in years. She swallowed hard. You were that little boy." His nod was slow, deliberate, and then just as she opened her mouth to speak again, he gestured toward the car parked at the curb. "I didn't come here just to thank you," he said. "I came here because I owe you more than you can imagine." Danielle's pulse spiked. She glanced at the car, then back at the man. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her world, so steady and predictable a moment ago, suddenly tilted on its axis. But how could one act of kindness 15 years ago bring this man to her doorstep with a car like that? 15 years earlier, the world looked different to Danielle Morris. Back then, life was a blur of clinking dishes, ringing phones, and the sharp scent of fryer oil that never quite left her hair no matter how many times she washed it. The Bluebird Diner sat on the corner of 8th and Main in Topeka, Kansas, a squat little building with chipped blue paint and a neon sign that flickered whenever the wind blew too hard. Danielle had been working there since she was 19. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. She knew the regulars by name, how they took their coffee, and which ones would try to sneak out without paying if she didn't keep an eye on them. That night had been slow. The dinner crowd was long gone, and the hum of the old ceiling fan was the only sound filling the empty booths. Danielle wiped down the counter, humming quietly to herself when the door creaked open and a gust of cool evening air slipped inside. She looked up, ready to paste on her usual smile, and froze. Two kids stood just inside the door, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 6 tops. Their clothes hung loose, faded, and worn, like they had been washed too many times and still couldn't shake the dirt. The boy's sneakers were ripped along the seams, and the little girl clutched his hands so tight her knuckles had gone white that Danielle's heart gave a little tug. Kids that age had no business being out this late without an adult. "Hi there," she called softly, setting the rag down. "You two lost." The boy shook his head, eyes darting toward the booths. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he guided his sister to the far corner where they slid into a seat like shadows. Trying not to be noticed, Danielle frowned. Something about the way they moved, quiet, careful, told her they weren't here by accident. She picked up 2 menus and walked over, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. "Evening, sweethearts," she said, keeping her tone light. "Kitchen's still open. You want something to eat?" The little girl peeked up from behind her brother's arm, big brown eyes filled with something Danielle couldn't quite name. Not fear. Not exactly. More like hope mixed with shame. The boy shook his head again, voice barely above a whisper. "Just water, please." Water, that was all. Danielle's chest tightened. "You sure?" she asked, glancing at their thin faces. "I've got pancakes, burgers, pie, anything you like." He hesitated, then looked away. "We don't have money." The way he said it, flat, matter of fact, made her throat ache. Danielle stood there for a second, menus dangling at her side, and felt something inside her twist. She thought about the $10 bill folded in her apron pocket, the one she'd been saving for gas to get home. She thought about her own childhood, about nights when she'd gone to bed with her stomach growling because her mama couldn't stretch a dollar far enough. Danielle crouched, so she was eye level with them. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Caleb," he said after a pause. "This is Hannah." "Well, Caleb and Hannah," Danielle said softly. "I think I can bend the rules tonight." The little girl's eyes widened. "You can." Danielle smiled. "Sure can. How about some grilled cheese and fries? Maybe a slice of pie to share." Hannah looked at her brother silent, as if asking permission. Caleb bit his lip, then nodded once. "Okay," he murmured. Danielle rose to her feet, forcing her voice to stay cheerful, even though her heart felt heavy. Coming right up, she headed for the kitchen, ignoring the sting in her eyes. She'd pay for it herself. Was $10 anyway? Gas could wait. Those kids needed food more than she needed a full tank. As the cook slapped bread on the griddle, Danielle glanced over her shoulder at the corner booth. Caleb sat stiff, shoulders squared like he was carrying a weight no child should bear. Hannah leaned against him, tiny and tired, her eyelids drooping. Danielle didn't know their story. She didn't ask. All she knew was they were hungry, and she could fix that, at least for tonight. But she didn't know that single choice would ripple through years she hadn't even lived yet. Danielle balanced the tray in her hands as she walked back to the booth. The warm scent of grilled cheese and golden fries drifting through the air. 2 tall glasses of milk sweated on the tray, alongside a slice of cherry pie, crowned with a dollop of whipped cream. When she set the plates down, Hannah's eyes lit up like a spark in the dark. Caleb straightened, his face tense like he was torn between relief and guilt. Danielle kept her voice soft. "Eat before it gets cold." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Hannah reached for a fry, tentative as a deer, sniffing the air. She bit into it, and the tiniest smile tugged at her lips. Caleb watched her, then finally picked up half of the grilled cheese. Danielle slid into the booth across from him without asking. She knew better than to hover like a waitress, expecting payment. These kids didn't owe her a thing. Caleb chewed slowly, his eyes darting to her and then away. Danielle waited, giving him space. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like old wood. You didn't have to do this." Danielle shrugged lightly, propping her chin on her hand. "Sure I did. You two walked in hungry. What kind of person would I be if I let you leave that way?" His jaw tightened, and he stared at the plate like the answers were hidden in the crumbs. People do it all the time. That landed heavy. Danielle felt it settle in her chest like a stone. She took a slow breath, watching Hannah nibble at the sandwich like it might disappear if she didn't eat fast enough. "Not tonight," Danielle said gently. "Not on my watch." Caleb's eyes flicked up then, sharp and guarded. "Why?" The question hung between them. Danielle thought about it for a beat, then gave the only answer that felt right. "Because somebody once did the same for me," she said, "and it mattered." Caleb blinked like he didn't know what to do with that. He looked at his sister, then back at Danielle, suspicion slowly giving way to something else, something softer. Hannah swallowed the last bite of her sandwich and whispered, "Thank you." Those two words nearly broke Danielle's heart. They were quiet, but they carried so much weight, like the little girl had never had much reason to say them before. Danielle reached across the table and brushed a crumb off Hannah's cheek. "You're welcome, sweet pea." Caleb didn't thank her. Not yet, but his eyes said enough. As they ate, Danielle asked the small questions. Nothing that would scare them off. "You two live close by?" Caleb shook his head. "Just around. You got someone waiting for you?" "No." The word was clipped. Final. Danielle swallowed hard, biting back more questions. She didn't want to push. Still, the thought of these kids out there alone made her stomach twist. "You sure you're okay out there?" She tried again, Caleb's jaw set like stone. "We're fine." "Danielle, let it go for now." Instead, she slid the plate with the pie toward them. "Share," she said with a smile. Hannah's eyes went wide at the bright red filling. "Cherry, best in town," Danielle said. The little girl's smile was pure sunlight in that dim corner. For the first time since they walked in, Caleb smiled too. A small, careful curve of his lips like he'd forgotten how. When the last crumbs were gone, Caleb reached for Hannah's hand and stood. "We should go." Danielle rose too, pulling 2 bills from her apron and slipping them under the plate before he could argue. "No charge," she said quickly. Waving off the protest already forming on his lips, his shoulders sagged. "We'll pay you back someday." Danielle chuckled softly. "Sweetheart, this isn't a loan." But he just nodded once, solemn as a judge, like he was making a promise he meant to keep. Then he took Hannah's hand and led her toward the door. She glanced back and waved with her tiny fingers before the glass door swung shut behind them. Danielle stood there for a long time after staring at the spot where they'd been. She didn't know their last name, didn't know where they were headed. All she knew was that 2 hungry kids had left with full bellies. And for tonight, that had to be enough. She had no way of knowing it wouldn't just be enough. It would change everything, the years between. But life didn't hand out happy endings overnight, and Danielle's own story was far from finished. The sound of the diner door swinging shut that night faded. But the memory of those 2 kids stuck like a thumbprint on Danielle's heart. For a while, she found herself glancing toward that corner booth during her shifts, half hoping, half dreading she'd see them again. She never did. Days bled into weeks, weeks into years. Danielle turned 30, then 35, then 40. Life didn't get easier, but it didn't get worse either. It just kept going. She stayed in Topeka for a while, working that same diner until the day it closed down for good. The owner had tears in his eyes when he told the staff. Chain restaurants had eaten up all the little places like theirs. Danielle packed her apron into a cardboard box and drove home with a lump in her throat the size of a fist. Bills kept showing up, same as always. Rent, utilities, the old sedan that coughed and rattled every time she turned the key. Danielle picked up shifts wherever she could. Cafes, truck stops, even a motel front desk for a stretch. None of it paid much. There were nights she sat at her kitchen table staring at a $1 bill, wondering how far she could stretch it. But Danielle was nothing if not stubborn. She never quit, never called it unfair. Life didn't owe her anything. That's what her mama used to say, and she believed it. She learned to make a dollar scream before it left her wallet. She patched her shoes with glue, wore thrift store jeans until they frayed at the knees, and told herself it was fine. She wasn't bitter. If anything, she tried to find small pieces of joy wherever they fit. A sunrise after a long shift, the laugh of a stranger in line, the smell of rain on hot pavement. Danielle didn't expect more, But deep down, on the nights when the house creaked and silence pressed and heavy, she wondered what happened to those two kids. Did they find a home? Did anyone love them enough to keep them safe? Or did life chew them up and spit them out like it did so many others? Sometimes when she let herself think about it too long, a knot formed in her chest. Because part of her knew if they'd asked, if they'd stayed, she would have done anything to keep them safe. Anything. 15 years. That's how long it had been. 15 birthdays, 15 Christmas mornings, 15 years of clocking in and clocking out, scraping by, living quiet. And then that car showed up. It was a blistering summer afternoon. Heat waves shimmering on the pavement. Danielle had just come in from hanging laundry when she heard it. The slow, smooth purr of an engine outside. Not the sound of a beat-up sedan or a rusty pickup like the neighbors drove. No, this was something different that, a T first, she thought maybe someone had taken a wrong turn off the highway. Fancy cars didn't belong on her street. Not on Evergreen Drive, where chain-link fences sagged and kids played basketball with hoops made from milk crates. Danielle stepped onto the porch, wiping sweat from her brow. And that's when she saw it. A car so shiny it looked like it had been dipped in ink. Black rims, tinted windows. It rolled to a stop at the curb like a panther crouching in tall grass. For a heartbeat, Danielle just stared, her breath snagging in her throat. People like her didn't get visitors like that. The door swung open and a man stepped out. Tall, broad shoulders, a suit that fit like it was tailored by angels. He turned, and when his gaze locked on hers, something inside Danielle shifted. There was recognition in his eyes. Not just a stranger's polite smile, something deeper. Danielle felt her pulse trip over itself as he closed the car door and started walking toward her. But what could a man like that possibly want with a woman like her? The man stopped at the edge of her walkway, his shoes crunching on the gravel. Up close, he looked even sharper. Everything about him screamed success, the kind of success Danielle had only ever seen on TV. His cufflinks glinted in the sunlight. His tie was the color of midnight. Danielle gripped the porch railing to keep her hands from shaking. Mrs. Morris. His voice was steady, warm, but there was something heavy behind it, like he'd been carrying this moment for a long time. She nodded slowly, trying to find her voice. "That's me." He smiled faintly, and for a second, something about that smile tugged at a thread deep in her memory, but her mind couldn't quite pull it loose. "Do I know you?" she asked, her tone hesitant, polite. The man tilted his head slightly as if the question didn't surprise him. "You knew me once a long time ago." Danielle blinked. She searched his face, strong jaw, clean-cut beard, eyes dark as polished stone, and came up empty. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice softening with apology. "I don't remember." His smile widened just a fraction. "That's okay. I wouldn't expect you to." Something in the way he said it made her throat tighten. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly small in her faded t-shirt and jeans. "You mind if I—" He gestured toward the porch, then stopped himself. "Actually, this might sound strange, but could we talk for a few minutes?" Danielle hesitated. A man in a car, like that showing up out of nowhere, asking talk. Every warning bell in her head went off. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone sharpening a little. He took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's about something you did 15 years ago." Danielle frowned, the words sliding around her brain without sticking. 15 years. He nodded once. "You were working at the Bluebird Diner." And just like that, her breath caught. The Bluebird. God, she hadn't heard that name in years. She could almost smell the coffee and hear the clatter of dishes just from the sound of it. Yeah, she said slowly. "I worked there for a long time." The man's expression softened like he'd been waiting for this moment, holding it like a fragile thing in his hands. "You don't remember me," he said gently. "But I remember you because that night you did something nobody else did. You saw two kids sitting in a corner booth with nothing but water in their glasses, and you fed them." Danielle's knees went weak. She gripped the railing harder, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Wait," she whispered. "Those kids." The man nodded. "I was the older one. My name's Caleb." The name hit her like a whisper from another lifetime. Danielle stared, her mind flashing back to a skinny boy with weary eyes and a little girl clinging to his side. Her voice cracked. "Oh my God, Caleb." He smiled then, not the polite, reserved smile from before, but something real warm, full of a gratitude so deep it made her chest ache. "Yeah," he said softly. "It's me." Danielle brought a hand to her mouth, stunned into silence. She couldn't reconcile the memory of that fragile boy with the man standing in front of her now, tall, confident, draped in wealth. I don't even know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything," Caleb replied, "because I didn't come here for words." Danielle blinked, her heart stuttering. "Then why? Why are you here?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. "Because I owe you everything," he said, "and I've spent 15 years waiting for the chance to show you what that means." Danielle stared, her mind spinning so fast it hurt. But what could she possibly have done back then to deserve something like this now? Caleb stepped onto the porch, moving with the same quiet confidence that had rattled Danielle the moment he got out of that car. She backed up slightly, giving him room. Her heart was still racing, pounding so hard she could feel in her throat. "Can I come in?" he asked gently. Danielle hesitated for a breath, then nodded. "Yeah, sure." Inside, her house was small and simple. Worn couch, faded curtains, the faint smell of coffee clinging to the air. Danielle suddenly felt self-conscious, like the scuffs on her floor and the mismatched chairs were screaming at him. But Caleb didn't seem to notice. He lowered himself into the old armchair like it was a throne. Danielle sat across from him, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles went white. "So talk to me. What's going on?" Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've been looking for you for years," he said quietly. "I didn't know your last name at first. All I remembered was your face and that your name was Danielle. I searched every way I could. And when I finally found you," he smiled faintly, "I knew I had to come in person." Danielle shook her head slowly, still trying to catch up. "Caleb, I fed you a meal. That's all. It was nothing." His eyes sharpened. "No, it was everything." Danielle blinked. "You have no idea what that night meant," Caleb continued. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath, raw, like a scar reopened. "We hadn't eaten in 2 days. 2 days, Danielle. I was trying to take care of Hannah, and I was a kid myself. I didn't know where else to go. That diner was the last place I thought anyone would care." Danielle felt her throat tighten as his words sank in. Caleb's gaze dropped for a second, his voice softening. "When you brought that plate to the table and the pie, it wasn't just food. It was hope. It was someone saying you matter. And when you said it wasn't alone," he looked up again, eyes shining. "That stuck with me. I promised myself that night that if I ever got the chance, I'd repay you tenfold." Danielle swallowed hard, her eyes burning. She wanted to speak, but the lump in her throat wouldn't let her. "I bounced around after that," Caleb said, leaning back. "Foster homes, group shelters. It wasn't easy, but I kept working. I studied. I refused to let that night be the last time someone believed in me. Eventually, I built something." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim envelope, setting on the coffee table between them. Danielle stared at it like it might bite her. "What's that?" "Your future," Caleb said simply. Her hands trembled as she slid the envelope closer and opened it. Inside was a check. At first, her brain didn't process the numbers. Too many zeros all lined up neat. When it hit her, her breath left in a sharp gasp. "Caleb, No, I can't take this." "You can," he said firmly. "And you will, because this isn't charity. It's a promise I made 15 years ago. A promise to give back to the person who gave when she didn't have to." Danielle pressed a hand to her chest, shaking her head. This is too much, Caleb. I fed you a sandwich and some pie. And that sandwich kept 2 kids alive another day." He cut in, his tone steady, but charged with emotion. "Don't you dare downplay that." Danielle blinked back tears, her vision swimming. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Caleb said softly. She laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound, and swiped at her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. The late afternoon light slanted through the thin curtains, painting the living room in soft gold. Danielle sat frozen, Her fingers still curled around the envelope like it might vanish if she let go. Outside, the luxury car gleamed at the curb, its polished surface catching the sun. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of bills pressing like a hand on her chest. For the first time in years, she could breathe. Caleb stood near the door, his phone in hand. "I'll call Hannah," he said. "If she picks up, I'll bring her tomorrow. She needs this." "Needs you?" Danielle swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. He stepped closer, crouching so they were eye level. "Don't be. Just talk to her like you did back then." That night, you gave her something she'd never had before. A reason to believe somebody cared. Danielle's eyes burned. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll try." Caleb smiled and squeezed her shoulder gently. "That's all you've ever done, Danielle. And look what it started." She allowed a shaky laugh, wiping at her cheeks. I never thought anyone would remember something like that." "I remembered," Caleb said firmly. "Every single day, you planted something that night, a seed. And even when life tried to crush it, I held on because you made me believe there was good out there." Danielle bit her lip, fighting back another wave of tears. "You don't know what this means to me, Caleb. You really don't." He shook his head. "No, Danielle, you don't know what you mean to me. To Hannah, this isn't just a thank you. It's a full circle." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Not heavy, not tense, just full. Full of everything words couldn't hold. Finally, Caleb slipped a set of keys from his pocket and laid them gently on the table. "Drive it whenever you want or never. Doesn't matter. Just know it's yours." Danielle stared at them, blinking hard. "What if I don't know how to live like this? What if I mess it up?" Caleb smiled, his voice steady. "You lived 15 years on scraps and hope. I think you'll figure this out just fine." A soft laugh escaped her. And for the first time in what felt like forever, wasn't bitter or tired. It was real. As Caleb headed for the door, he turned back one last time. "Tomorrow." Danielle nodded slowly. "Tomorrow." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Danielle in the quiet of her little house. A house that suddenly felt too small for the size of the future stretching out ahead of her. She looked down at the check in her lap, then at the keys glinting in the golden light, and she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking, "Thank you, God. Thank you." Outside, the car's engine purred softly as Caleb drove away, the sound fading into the distance, like the closing of one chapter and the start of another. Sometimes the smallest acts, ones we barely notice, carry the biggest weight. A sandwich, a slice of pie, a kind word. You never know who's watching, who's holding on to that moment like a lifeline. And maybe years later, that kindness comes back to you in ways you could never imagine. If you're watching this, let this story remind you. Kindness costs nothing, but it changes everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Your one click might inspire another act of kindness that changes a life.